On the morning of Tuesday, October 8th, 2019, three black SUVs turned onto the gravel road leading into Millard Crossing, Nebraska, and the sound they made pulling into the parking lot of the Harlan County Community Hall was the sound of money that had already decided it had won. They came in a convoy. The first carried Preston Vane and two associates from the law firm of Vane, Breck, and Holloway out of Omaha. The second carried a pair of field analysts from Agricor Land Development. The third carried audio-visual equipment, a portable projection screen, a laptop loaded with drone footage and topographic overlays, and three cardboard boxes of glossy presentation folders, printed in Agricor's corporate blue and gold. Vane stepped out of the first vehicle and straightened his jacket. He was 43 years old, lean and precise, with the kind of face that was permanently arranged in the expression of a man who had somewhere else to be. His shoes were clean. That detail mattered in a county where the parking lot was gravel and the September rains had left the edges soft with mud. He had worn good shoes anyway. He always did. The community hall of Millard Crossing had hosted pancake breakfasts, county fair planning meetings, 4-H award ceremonies, and one memorable argument about a property line dispute that lasted 3.5 hours and ended with two brothers not speaking for a decade. It smelled of old coffee and wooden floors, and the particular damp of a building that is heated only when it is in use. The American flag in the corner had been there long enough that its fringe had faded from gold to the color of old straw. 41 people had come to the meeting. Vane had expected fewer. He had prepared for more. He had done this enough times in enough small Nebraska counties to know that the number in the room rarely changed the outcome. What changed the outcome was paperwork, and Agricor had more of it than anyone else in the state. He took his position at the front table and watched his associates set up the projection screen. The laptop opened. The drone footage of the valley began to play on the wall behind him, smooth and aerial and impossibly green for October shot in June, when the grass was still high, and the creek at the bottom of the valley was running clear. It was a beautiful piece of land. That was the problem. That was, in fact, the entire problem. Let me tell you about the 15 acres at the bottom of Mercer Valley, because without understanding what those acres meant, nothing else that happened in that room on that October morning makes any sense. The Mercer farm sat on 340 acres of rolling Nebraska tableland. Most of it good for corn and soybeans, decent ground, solid ground. The kind of ground that a careful farmer could work for generations without exhausting it. But the 15 acres at the lowest point of the property were something different. They were valley floor acres fed by a natural spring that surfaced through a limestone shelf about 90 feet below grade. The spring had been running continuously since before any European had set foot in Nebraska. It produced in an average year roughly 1.4 million gallons of clean water. Agricor had been planning a $40 million agricultural development facility on the surrounding 2,300 acres they had already acquired over the previous 4 years. Processing capacity for 18 counties. Cold storage. Distribution infrastructure. A project that would, their press materials said, bring 340 permanent jobs to a region that had been losing population since 1987. The facility required water, a great deal of it. The county aquifer at that depth ran inconsistent in that section. Agricor had drilled 3 test wells in the past 18 months. 2 had come up at less than 30% of the volume projected. 1 had come up dry. The spring on the Mercer property was not a convenience. It was a necessity. Without those 15 acres and the water rights attached to them, the Agricor facility could not function at the scale that justified the investment. The company had known this for 2 years. They had been working toward acquiring those acres through every available channel for 2 years. The math was simple enough that anyone in that room could have worked it on a napkin. Agricor had already spent $2.3 million on surveys, legal preparation, county permitting processes, and infrastructure planning that depended on that water source. If they did not acquire those 15 acres, the $2.3 million was not recoverable. If they did not acquire those 15 acres, the $40 million facility did not get built. If the facility did not get built, the jobs projection went back to zero. And the county commissioners who had publicly backed the project would have a great deal of explaining to do in an election year. Vane had explained all of this to the current owner of those 15 acres on 2 separate occasions, once by letter and once in a meeting at her kitchen table the previous April. Both times she had listened politely. Both times she had said she needed more time. Both times he had left without what he came for. Her name was Ruth Mercer. She was 72 years old. She had lived on that land for 50 years. Her husband Gene had farmed it for 28 years, before his heart gave out in 2014. And before that, his father had broken the original ground in 1931. The farmhouse had a kitchen table that Gene had built from 2 planks of old-growth oak, and the kitchen smelled of coffee, and the particular earthy permanence of a house that has been lived in by the same family long enough that it has stopped trying to be anything other than what it is. Vane had noted in his file that Mrs. Mercer was a pleasant woman, with outdated ideas about the value of her land. His current offer was $340 per acre. For the 15 acres, a total of $500 for land and water rights combined. He considered this generous. His appraisal team had assessed comparable valley floor acreage in the county at $160 to $190 per acre for the land itself. He had rounded up significantly. He had attached a 2-page summary of the economic benefits the Agricor facility would bring to the county. He had brought 41 copies of that summary to the meeting, one for every chair. What his appraisal team had not factored in because they had not been asked to was the water. A spring producing 1.4 million gallons per year consistently in a county where reliable groundwater was becoming a genuine problem was worth considerably more than the land it sat on. An agricultural water rights attorney in Lincoln, if consulted, would have put the figure somewhere north of $80,000, possibly considerably north. Vane knew this. He had chosen his number anyway. Ruth Mercer was sitting in the back row. She had arrived 20 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin and taken the last seat on the right side of the last row. She was wearing a clean cotton dress in a dark blue print that had the look of something that had been carefully maintained rather than recently purchased. Her shoes were the practical leather kind. Her hair was white and pinned back with 2 small clips. She carried a canvas bag, faded and soft, with used, the kind of bag that has been carried so many times it has lost any particular shape of its own and simply holds whatever is put into it. She sat with the bag on her lap and her hands resting on top of it and watched the Agricor associates set up their projection equipment with the steady, unhurried attention of a woman who had been watching things unfold for a very long time and had learned not to confuse motion with progress. She knew 22 of the 41 people in the room by name. She had gone to high school with 4 of them. She had attended the funerals of 3 of their parents. She had brought casseroles to 2 families in that room when they went through difficult years, and they had brought casseroles to her when Gene died. This was a community, and it was her community, and she had been part of it for half a century. But this morning, the person she was looking at was her son. Thomas Mercer was 46 years old, broad through the shoulders the way his father had been, with Gene's dark hair gone mostly gray at the temples. He had driven up from Lincoln the night before, arriving after Ruth had already eaten dinner, and was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. They had talked for 2 hours. The conversation had been careful and circular, and had not ended well. Thomas was a civil engineer. He had left the farm at 18, gone to the University of Nebraska on an academic scholarship, built a career that had nothing to do with cornfields and everything to do with load-bearing calculations and drainage systems and the management of large-scale construction projects. He was good at his work. He was a reasonable man. He loved his mother. He had also, in the past 2 years, become convinced that the practical thing to do was to sell the 15 acres to Agricor and use the money to help Ruth transition off the remaining farmland into something more manageable for a woman her age. He sat down in the 4th row from the front on the left side. He did not sit in the back row with Ruth. He chose a seat that was neither obviously aligned with Agricor nor obviously aligned with his mother. He told himself this was a neutral position. Ruth looked at the back of his head and understood exactly what it was. She put her hands on the canvas bag in her lap. She did not look away from him for a long moment. Then she looked at the projection screen where the drone footage of her valley was playing on a loop, smooth and aerial, and silent. Preston Vane called the meeting to order at 9:03 in the morning. He thanked everyone for coming. He introduced himself and his team. He acknowledged the county commissioner who was present, a man named Fitch, who had the look of someone attending an event he had already decided the outcome of. Vane clicked through the drone footage with the ease of someone who had given this particular presentation many times and had refined it to its most persuasive form. The numbers were presented in large, clear fonts. 340 jobs, $40 million of investment, a 12% projected increase in county tax revenue by year 3. A graphic showing the water table of the county with the Agricor facility's projected usage highlighted in blue, tidy and contained and responsible looking. Another graphic showing the economic trajectory of Harlan County over the previous 2 decades, which was a line going in one direction downward, interrupted by the Agricor logo at the end, with an arrow suggesting a different direction was now possible. He was good at this. He had the measured, pleasant confidence of a man who lived inside information and trusted that information to do most of his work for him. Have you ever been in a room where the expertise was so thick in the air that disagreeing with it felt like disagreeing with the weather? Where every number on every slide pointed the same direction, and the presentation was so complete and so professional that the idea of objecting seemed almost embarrassing, the way it would be embarrassing to raise your hand in a lecture hall and question the professor on a subject he has been teaching for 20 years. That is what that room felt like. Vane got to the acquisition portion of the presentation at 9:31. He spoke about the Mercer property with the careful language of someone who is aware that the owner is in the room, but has made a decision not to address her directly until the terms are on the table. He described the 15 acres by their legal parcel designation. He described the spring by its measured flow rate, presented in a way that framed it primarily as a resource management challenge that Agricor was prepared to handle responsibly. He presented the offer $340 per acre total consideration of $5,100 with a 90-day close and a full legal transfer of water rights. Then he paused. He looked up from his notes. He found Ruth Mercer in the back row with the practice scan of a man who had been keeping track of where she was the entire time. He smiled. It was not an unfriendly smile. It was the smile of a man extending a courtesy he had no particular reason to extend, the smile of someone in a fundamentally stronger position, choosing for the sake of the room to be gracious about it. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "we appreciate your patience while we laid out the full picture. We want to make sure you have everything you need to make a fully informed decision." Ruth looked at him. The room turned a wave of faces, 40 people shifting in their folding chairs to look at the woman in the back row, with the canvas bag on her lap. She did not speak. She did not smile. She simply met his gaze with the particular steadiness of a person who has been doing difficult things quietly for a long time and does not require an audience's approval to continue. The night before, she had not slept. Let me take you back to the evening before the meeting, because what happened in that farmhouse kitchen on the night of Monday, October 7th, is the part of this story that most people would never see. And that explains everything about why Ruth Mercer walked into that community hall the way she did. After Thomas and Linda had gone upstairs, Ruth sat at Jean's table. The kitchen was quiet in the way that only a farmhouse can be quiet, which is to say it was not entirely quiet. The refrigerator ran. The old clock on the wall measured the minutes with a tick that had been part of every night of her life in this house for 50 years. Outside, the wind moved across the fields with the dry, papery sound of late October, when the corn has been in for weeks, and the stalks left standing rattle against each other like old bones. She had placed the iron box on the table in front of her. It was small, maybe 8 inches by 5 inches gray, painted metal with a hinged lid and a latch that took a small key. The kind of box sold at hardware stores in the 1960s for keeping important papers. Jean had bought it at the feed store in Willow Creek in 1965 and used it for exactly that purpose for the next 49 years, until his heart gave out and Ruth had moved it from his desk to the kitchen cabinet above the refrigerator where it had stayed ever since. The key was on a ring with 3 others that had hung on a hook by the door since before Thomas was born. Jean had never been secretive about the box. He had never been demonstrative about it either. He had simply maintained it the way he maintained everything consistently without announcement, as part of the regular business of a careful life. He had told her once, maybe 15 years before he died, sitting at this same table after supper, that the box was important. He had not elaborated. He had said there were papers in it that mattered, and that if anything ever happened to the land, she should open it before she signed anything. That was all. She had understood him and had not pressed for details. That was the nature of their partnership. She trusted his preparation the way she trusted the soil to do what soil does when worked correctly. She had opened the box that evening for the first time in years. The contents were organized with the same methodical precision that Jean had applied to everything he cared about. 3 separate envelopes, each one labeled in his handwriting with the year it contained, and a 2 or 3 word description. The oldest was 1967. Labeled Spring Rights. The middle was 1978, labeled Valley Easement. The newest was 1989, labeled Before Surgery. She had read all 3. She was still sitting at the table with the papers spread before her when Thomas came back downstairs for a glass of water at 11:15 at night. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and looked at the papers and understood immediately what she was doing. He sat down across from her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers without touching them. "Mom," he said, "those documents are 30 years old. The oldest one is more than 50 years old." Ruth did not look up from the page she was reading. "Your father filed these for a reason," she said. "I know he did. But legal filings from 1967 don't just... they expire, Mom. Laws change. You need someone who practices property law to look at this. Not tonight. Not like this." She looked up at him then. She looked at him the way she had looked at him when he was 14, and had told her that the old tractor Jean kept in the back shed was obsolete, and they should get rid of it. The same look. The one that said she was choosing her response carefully. "Your father was not a man who kept papers for no reason," she said. Thomas put his elbows on the table. He was tired. He had driven 2 hours from Lincoln after a full day of work. His patience, which was genuine and substantial, was fraying at the edges. "I know that. I know who he was. But Mom, listen to me. Agricor has 3 lawyers, a team of analysts, and county support. You have a box of documents from a hardware store. Even if those filings were completely solid when Gene made them, the process of challenging a formal acquisition on the basis of old records is not something you can do alone in a community hall tomorrow morning with a canvas bag. He said it gently. He said it because he meant it, because he loved her. Because he was genuinely afraid that she was going to walk into that room and embarrass herself in front of people she had known her whole life. And come home having lost anyway. Ruth folded the papers carefully along their original creases. She placed them back in their envelopes. She placed the envelopes back in the iron box in their order. 1967. 1978, 1989, oldest to newest. The way Gene had kept them. She closed the lid and latched it. You might be right, she said. She said it without looking at him. Then she picked up the box and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling its weight. She stood up from the table. I'm going to bed, she said. Thank you for coming, Thomas. He watched her carry the box back to the kitchen cabinet and stand it on the shelf above the refrigerator. He watched her fold the canvas bag neatly and place it on the counter. He watched her turn off the kitchen light and walk toward the hallway without looking back. He sat alone in the dark kitchen for a few minutes after she left. He was trying to decide if he should be relieved or worried. He settled on a combination of both and went to bed. Ruth lay in the dark for 3 hours without sleeping. She looked at the ceiling of the room she had shared with Gene for 46 years. She thought about the box. She thought about the night before Gene's surgery in 1989. Sitting in this same room, this same darkness, with the same kind of uncertainty pressing down from above. She thought about what he had said to her that night, very quietly in the way he said the things that mattered most to him. I've written everything down. It's in the box. The land knows what it's been through. We just have to make sure the record does, too. She got up at 5:30. She dressed. She made coffee. She took the box down from the shelf. She placed it in the canvas bag. She sat at Gene's table and drank her coffee in the gray Nebraska morning, and did not think about whether she was right or wrong. She thought about a man who had filed papers at a county courthouse in 1967. When he was 22 years old and had trusted that the act of recording a true thing would outlast the people who preferred it unrecorded. That is the kind of patience that takes a lifetime to build. It is not a passive thing. It is not resignation. It is something harder and rarer, the willingness to do the correct thing in the present moment and trust the future to recognize it. Back in the community hall, Vane was still looking at her. The room was still turned in her direction. Ruth lifted the canvas bag from her lap. She set it on the empty chair beside her. She reached inside and withdrew the iron box. She placed it on the chair as well, resting on the bag where the room could see it. She opened the latch. The sound was small in the quiet room. She did not move to the front. She did not stand. She simply sat in her chair in the back row and looked at Preston Vane and said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely clear, I have some questions about the water rights. There was a shift in the room. Subtle. The kind of shift that happens when a space that has been moving in one direction encounters something that is not moving with it. Vane maintained his expression. He was very good at maintaining his expression. Of course, he said. That is why we're here. He had prepared for this. He had prepared for several versions of Ruth Mercer. He had prepared for an emotional version, an elderly woman who would talk about her husband's memory and the family connection to the land, which could be handled with warmth and patience. He had prepared for a stubborn version, a woman who simply refused to engage, which could be handled with time and incremental pressure. He had prepared for a version that had consulted a lawyer, which could be handled with superior legal resources. He had not prepared for the version sitting in the back row with an iron box. She reached into the box and removed 3 envelopes. She held them in her hands without opening them. She looked at them the way you look at something you have been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. In the spring of 1967, she said, "My husband, Gene Mercer, filed a water rights declaration with Harlan County for the natural spring on the lower 15 acres of our property. The filing established primary agricultural water rights recorded under state statute and registered with the county recorder's office." She paused. The room had stopped shuffling. The projector was still running the drone footage on the wall behind Vane, that smooth aerial green, but no one was looking at it. Vane kept his expression neutral. He glanced at one of his associates. A quick professional exchange of looks that communicated several things at once. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice pitched with the warmth of a man being generous, "a declaration filed in 1967 would be subject to the subsequent legal framework that has governed water rights in Nebraska for the past 50 years. Water law has evolved considerably since then, and we have conducted a thorough title search that accounts for all recorded instruments. I want to assure you and everyone in this room that AgriCorps' acquisition process has been fully compliant with current county and state requirements." He said all of this pleasantly. He said all of it with the confidence of someone who has the information and has organized it correctly and knows where all the pieces are. He said it in the tone used by people who know more than you do and are choosing to be kind about it. In the 4th row from the front, Thomas Mercer was looking at his hands. What Vane did not say because he did not know to say. It was this, that there are 2 different kinds of water rights in Nebraska, and that a primary agricultural declaration filed before 1974 under the old riparian framework carried protections that the current prior appropriation doctrine did not automatically supersede. What he did not know was that Gene Mercer had understood this distinction in 1967 because a neighbor named Walter Stills had lost his water access in a development dispute in 1964, and Gene had gone to the county law library in Kearney and spent 3 days reading before he filed anything. Gene had read the law. He had understood which instrument offered the most durable protection. He had used that instrument. He had trusted that the record would outlast the people who came after him. Ruth looked at Preston Vane. She had heard his explanation. She had understood every word of it. Then she opened the second envelope. "The filing from 1978, she said. Her voice was still level. The room that had been holding its breath let it out slowly, not in relief but in recognition. Something was happening here. Everyone in that room could feel it. The way you feel weather changing before you can see it. The air pressure shifting, the quality of the light going different. It was not triumph. It was not drama. It was simply the particular gravity that settles over a room when someone quietly produces something they have been quietly carrying for a very long time. In the 4th row from the front, Thomas Mercer had stopped looking at his hands. He was looking at the back of the room. He was looking at his mother. Preston Vane was still smiling. It was a different smile now, thinner and more careful, the smile of a man recalculating. And Glenn Albright, seated toward the side of the room in a chair he had positioned slightly apart from the other county officials. A big-shouldered man of 55. With the practiced stillness of someone who had spent decades in the business of other people's financial difficulty, was watching Ruth Mercer with an attention that had not been there 5 minutes ago. an attention that was something other than curiosity. Ruth held the second envelope in her hands. She did not open it yet. She looked at the room with the calm, settled expression of a woman who had driven through 50 Nebraska winters, raised a son, buried a husband, and run 340 acres on her own for 5 years. A woman who had sat alone in a dark kitchen the night before and decided that the correct thing to do was the same as it had always been. Show up. Know your ground. Trust the record. She said, "This is a conservation easement, registered with the Nebraska Land Trust in October of 1978. It covers the 15-acre valley parcel and the spring water rights attached to it. Under the terms of that easement, the parcel cannot be converted to commercial or industrial use by any buyer. Ever." The projector was still running the drone footage on the wall. The valley green and smooth and aerial played on behind Preston Vane's shoulder as the silence in the room reached its absolute point. And then Thomas Mercer in the fourth row from the front made a sound that was not quite a word. A short, unguarded sound, the sound a man makes when something he thought he understood turns out to be something entirely different. He was looking at his mother. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Preston Vane. And Preston Vane was looking at the iron box on the chair in the back row of the Harlan County Community Hall, sitting on a faded canvas bag in October of 2019, holding documents that a careful man had placed inside it more than 50 years ago, and trusted the world to find when the world finally needed to find them. Preston Vane had not moved from his position at the front table. His hands were resting on the leather portfolio in front of him, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who was performing calm, because the alternative was not available to him in a public setting. He had understood what Ruth Mercer had just said. He was very good at understanding things quickly. That was, in fact, what he was paid for. And what he understood in the 11 seconds of silence that followed her statement about the 1978 conservation easement was that this meeting had departed from its intended shape and that the departure required management. He took a breath. He opened his portfolio. He removed a document from the section tabbed with a yellow marker and placed it on the table in front of him, with the deliberate motion of a man who has been here before and knows where the exits are. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He kept his voice even pleasant. The practiced register of someone extending patience they have not been asked to extend. What you are describing is consistent with what our title research team identified during the acquisition process. The 1978 Nebraska Land Trust registration is in our records. We are aware of it. He paused to let that land, to let the room understand that he had known about this, that nothing she had said was new information, that he was not a man who arrived at a room without having read the room first. The conservation easement registered in 1978, he continued, was subject to modification under a subsequent agreement executed by the landowner in 1989. That agreement, which we have fully recorded copies of, superseded the easement protections with respect to commercial water access under a specific carve-out provision. The legal framework is well established. This was handled in our due diligence review, and I want to be transparent with everyone in this room that the acquisition we are proposing today is fully consistent with the recorded title history of that parcel. He said this the way you would explain a misunderstanding to someone who had misread a simple document. Gently, thoroughly, with the implication that the error was understandable, that no one was at fault, and that the correct information was now available to correct it. Ruth was looking at him. She had not opened the third envelope. In the fourth row, Thomas exhaled slowly. It was the exhale of a man who has been dreading something and has now arrived at it and is trying to decide if that is a relief or not. Glenn Albright, seated toward the side wall, shifted his weight in his chair. A small movement. The kind a large man makes when something has changed and he is recalibrating. Vane reached into his portfolio and removed a second document. A photocopy clean and professionally reproduced, and held it up so the room could see it, without being close enough to read it. The 1989 agreement, he said, was executed by Eugene Mercer in his capacity as sole title holder of the parcel. It granted limited commercial water access rights to Harlan Valley Development Partners in exchange for consideration paid. The terms included a provision allowing subsequent transfer to any successor, commercial interest with valid county permit standing. Agricor acquired that interest as part of our preliminary work in this county in 2017. The chain of title is complete and unbroken. He set the document down. He looked at Ruth. Your husband negotiated that agreement, Mrs. Mercer. We understand this may be difficult to reconcile with your current position, but the record is what the record is. He said it without malice. That was the thing about Vane. There was no cruelty in him. There was only the clean, complete confidence of someone who lived inside information and had organized it correctly, and could not genuinely imagine that the organization was wrong. Thomas turned in his chair to look at his mother. His face had the complicated expression of a man who loves someone and is watching them encounter something painful and does not know how to help, because he had told them this might happen. It was pity. It was the specific kind of pity that comes from being right about something you did not want to be right about. Ruth sat with the iron box open in her lap and the third envelope in her hands and looked at Preston Vane with no particular expression on her face. She said, "When was that document signed?" Vane glanced at the photocopy. October 14th, 1989. She nodded once. A small, definite movement. The movement of someone who has just heard a number they were expecting to hear. She opened the third envelope. Let me tell you what Gene Mercer did on October 7th, 1989. Because the distance between that date and October 14th of that year is the distance between everything that happened next. On the morning of October 7th, Gene Mercer drove himself to the Harlan County Hospital in Willow Creek. With chest pain that had been building since the previous Thursday, Ruth had wanted to call an ambulance. Gene had said he would drive. That was the kind of man he was. He had driven himself carefully at 40 miles an hour with the radio off, and he had walked into the emergency room and told the nurse at the desk that he thought he was having a heart event and would like someone to look at him when they had a moment. He was in surgery by noon. His heart, which had worked without complaint through 44 Nebraska winters and 22 corn harvests and 3 separate decades of carrying more than most men carry, had developed a blockage that required immediate intervention. The surgery lasted 4 hours. He spent the following 6 days in the intensive care unit. He was sedated for 5 of those 6 days. Ruth had sat beside his bed on a plastic chair and held his hand and talked to him about things that did not require him to respond. He came home on October 19th, 5 days after the date on the document Preston Vane had just placed on the table. He spent 2 weeks in bed before he was well enough to sit at the kitchen table. He did not sign any documents during that period. He was not capable of signing documents during that period. Ruth removed the papers from the third envelope and placed them on the chair beside her in a careful stack. The top sheet was a document from Harlan County Hospital. It was dated. It showed admission date, procedure date, discharge date. It showed the attending physician. It showed the ICU stay. The information was clear and specific, and had the particular unambiguous quality of medical records, which are maintained not for sentiment, but for accuracy. Because accuracy in medicine is a matter of life and outcome, and is not subject to negotiation. She held it up. She did not speak immediately. She let the room look at what she was holding. Let people see that it was a document from a hospital. Let them read the dates in the header. Then she said my husband was admitted to the ICU on October 7th, 1989. He was sedated from October 8th through the 13th. He was discharged on October 19th. He did not leave the hospital between those dates. He was not capable of executing a legal document on October 14th. He was not capable of executing a legal document on any date in that range. The room absorbed this. Vane was looking at the document she was holding. He was still holding his expression. But there was something happening behind it now, a rapid and invisible rearrangement. The way a building looks identical from the outside, in the seconds after something structural has shifted inside. This is a significant claim, he said. And his voice for the first time had something in it that was not quite perfect. A thinning, a fraction of a degree toward careful. You are suggesting the signature on a recorded legal document is invalid. Ruth lowered the hospital record. She placed it on top of the other papers on the chair beside her. I am not suggesting it, she said. I am telling you that on the date your document was signed, my husband was in an ICU bed in this county sedated under the care of Dr. Howard Keeler at Harlan County Hospital. The record is what the record is. She used his own words. She said them the same way he had said them, level and complete, and without apology. Glenn Albright stood up. It was a fluid movement for a large man, practiced the movement of someone accustomed to standing when a room requires reorientation. He was not heading for the door, not yet. He was simply standing in the particular way that people stand when they are buying themselves 2 or 3 seconds they need. His name was Glenn Albright. He was 55 years old, a large-shouldered man who had run Harlan County Savings and Loan for 19 years. Having taken over the position from the man who had hired him as a loan officer in 1996. He had a broad, steady face and hands that looked capable, and a voice that had spent 2 decades delivering news. Some of it welcome, most of it not to people who sat across his desk in difficult years. He was not an unkind man. He was a man who had made a choice in 1989 when he was 25 years old and a junior notary at a firm in Kearney, and had continued to make choices in the intervening 30 years that were predicated on the assumption that the first choice would stay buried. He had known about the iron box. He had not known exactly what was in it. Linda Mercer had known about Glenn Albright. She was sitting 3 seats to Thomas's left in the 4th row, and she had been quiet through everything that had preceded this moment, with the focused quiet of someone watching a road they know and waiting for the turn they have been expecting. She was 43 years old, with the careful, observant quality of someone who had trained herself to notice what other people preferred not to notice. And she had developed that quality in part because of 14 months she had spent as a loan processing assistant at Harlan County Savings and Loan between 1999 and 2001. She had been 23 years old when she worked there. She had filed documents. She had processed applications. She had sat in a small office adjacent to the main floor and handled the paperwork that moved through a county bank during the particular years when rural Nebraska was still climbing out of the wreckage of the farm crisis, and the institutions that had facilitated that wreckage were working very hard to present themselves as partners in recovery. She had noticed in those 14 months several things about Glenn Albright that she had filed away in the manner of a young woman who has learned that the things she observes in powerful men are best kept quietly until they become relevant. One of those things was that Albright had on at least 2 occasions she could document certified documents as notary that he could not have personally witnessed being signed, because the signers were not present in his office on those dates. She had never said anything. She had left the job when she and Thomas got serious, and she relocated to Lincoln, and she had put it away in the same internal cabinet where a person stores the things they know but cannot yet use. She used it now. She leaned forward in her chair and said Thomas's name quietly. And when he turned, she said to him in a voice low enough that only he could hear it, that the notary on that 1989 document needed to be checked. She said she knew things about how Albright handled notarizations during that period. She said that if the signature was on a document dated October 14th, 1989, and the notary stamp was Albright's, she could tell him things about that certification that would matter. Thomas looked at her. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you realize they have been carrying something for a long time that you knew nothing about. Then he turned back to face the front of the room. He said nothing immediately. He was a civil engineer. He was a man who dealt in load calculations and structural integrity and the relationship between what a system claimed to support and what it actually could. He was looking at the room the way he looked at a site plan when something in it did not add up. Ruth had not heard any of this. She was focused on Vane. Vane had recovered his surface. He was speaking again, returning to the cadence of professional certainty, but it was costing him more now. The information was moving too fast. The hospital record was real. He could see that it was real. It had the weight and the format of something produced by an institution with no stake in the outcome, and his title research team had not flagged a contested signature because his title research team had looked at the document as a completed instrument and had not gone looking behind it. This is a matter that would require independent verification, he said. Allegations of this nature claims about the validity of a recorded instrument. These are legal proceedings that belong in a courtroom, not a community meeting. He was right about this. It was the correct procedural response. He said it as a way of restoring the ground beneath him, of moving the conversation back into territory where his resources exceeded hers, where his 3 lawyers and his filing cabinets and his superior budget for legal proceedings could be brought to bear. Ruth picked up the next sheet from the stack on the chair. This document, she said, is an affidavit of legal capacity protection filed with the Nebraska Secretary of State's office on October 6, 1989. She let that date sit in the air for a moment. October 6th. The day before, Gene drove himself to the hospital. She continued, under Nebraska statute, the affidavit specifies that any legal instrument purporting to carry the signature of Eugene Arthur Mercer during a period of medical incapacity as defined by attending physician certification shall be considered void and without legal force. The filing was made voluntarily in anticipation of a scheduled surgical procedure and is recorded in the state's Office of Vital Legal Instruments. A copy was retained by Clara Hutchins, who was at that time the Assistant County Recorder for Harlan County. The room had gone very still. There was a woman seated against the far wall near the door, who had not been introduced at the start of the meeting because she had not come as a participant in the meeting. She was 70 years old with white hair and the dry, specific alertness of someone who has spent decades in the management of documents and has developed a professional relationship with accuracy that most people reserve for things they love. Her name was Clara Hutchins. She was the current Harlan County Records Supervisor, a title she had held for 22 years and would hold until she decided to stop holding it, which she had not yet decided. She had known Gene Mercer since 1967, when a 22-year-old farmer had come into the county records office with a water rights declaration and had asked her predecessor, a man named Denton, very specific questions about the most durable form of primary rights protection available under current Nebraska statute. She had been 18 years old and working her first year at the records office, and she had listened to the conversation and to Denton's answers, and she had thought, This one is going to be all right. This one reads before he signs. In 1989, she had been the one to call Jean. She had been 40 years old, the assistant county recorder, and she had received a request to pull the parcel maps for the Mercer Valley property from a man who had identified himself as a representative of a development interest. The request was not illegal. It was public record access. But it was the second such request in 3 months from 2 different parties. And that pattern was the kind of thing Clara Hutchins noticed. She had called Jean because she knew him and because she believed that a man who had been careful about something deserved to know when someone else was being careful about the same thing from the other direction. Jean had thanked her. He had said he would take care of it. 4 days later, he drove himself to the hospital. But before he drove himself to the hospital at 8:30 in the morning of October 6th, he had walked into the office of Harold Sykes, a property attorney in Willow Creek, and had filed the affidavit. Clara had retained her copy in the county records vault because Jean had asked her to, and because she believed in the record the way Jean believed in the record, which was to say, completely and without reservation. She sat against the far wall and watched Ruth Mercer present the documentation that Jean had trusted her to hold. And she did not say anything, and she did not need to. Now let me tell you about something else that was happening in Harlan County, Nebraska, because the story of the meeting in the community hall was not the only story unfolding in that valley that October morning. 3 miles from where Ruth Mercer was sitting with her iron box at the edge of the 2,300 acres that Agricor had already acquired, there was a center pivot irrigation system that Agricor had installed the previous spring as a proof of concept for the facility's operational model. It was a modern system, digitally managed GPS monitored, running off a well that Agricor's field team had drilled to what their geological survey indicated was the optimal depth for the county aquifer in that section. The system had been running since May. It was now October. The harvest data from the Agricor managed parcels was in, and it was not the data the presentation slides had been built on. Projected yield for the corn parcels 187 bushels per acre, based on the soil quality and water delivery models Agricor had used to justify the facility investment. Actual yield 124 bushels per acre. The shortfall was 34%. The reason for the shortfall was water delivery inconsistency driven by a geological condition that Agricor's survey team had not accounted for, a clay lens at 340 feet that interrupted the lateral flow of the aquifer and created a pressure differential that reduced effective output from their well by 40% during peak draw periods. Specifically, the critical 21-day window in late July when corn is in tassel and requires consistent moisture above all else. 124 bushels per acre at the current market price of $3.80 per bushel on a pilot acreage of 160 acres had returned approximately $75,300 gross against operating costs of $61,000. Leaving a net of $14,300 on 160 acres for a full growing season. That was a margin of $89 per acre. Agricor's facility model had been built on a margin assumption of $220 per acre. The clay lens was a known geological feature of that section of Harlan County. It had been documented in the Agricultural Extension Service records since 1954. Any farmer who had worked that land long enough, or who had read the extension records before drilling, would have known about it. Jean Mercer had known about it. In the iron box behind the 3 envelopes, there was a small notebook. Green cover spiral bound, the kind sold at farm supply stores. Jean had kept it since 1971. It contained, among other things, 18 pages of handwritten observations about the water table behavior in the Mercer Valley parcel across 4 different drought years. It contained notes about the clay lens, about the pressure differential, about the specific depths, at which the aquifer ran reliable versus inconsistent in different sections of the county. It contained a notation from 1973 that read, "Anyone drilling in the east section above 380 feet will regret it by August." Agricor's well was at 340 feet. Ruth did not mention the notebook in the meeting. She did not need to. But it was in the box, and it was part of what Gene had left behind, the accumulated evidence of a man who had paid attention to his land for decades and had written down what he learned, because he understood that the value of knowledge is exactly zero if it dies with the person who holds it. Have you ever watched someone build something for 40 years and then watched someone else in a single season discover the exact mistake your careful friend had spent 40 years learning to avoid? There is a particular feeling that comes with that. It is not satisfaction. It is something older and sadder. The feeling of a lesson that could have been learned from the record, if anyone had bothered to read the record. Preston Vane was speaking. He was speaking in the measured tones of a man who has decided that the correct strategy is to move the conflict to a different arena, one where his advantages are more decisive. He was talking about the proper legal channels for challenging recorded instruments. He was talking about the county's established process for title disputes. He was saying all the right words in all the right order with the complete professional competence of a man who had spent his career turning messy situations into orderly procedures. And then Linda Mercer stood up. She stood up in the fourth row, and the room turned the way it had turned for Ruth, that same wave of folding chair faces. And Thomas looked at her with the expression of a man who was no longer certain what was about to happen. She addressed the room, not Vane specifically. Her voice was clear and carried without strain. She said that she had worked at Harlan County Savings and Loan between 1999 and 2001 in the loan processing department, and that during that time she had observed Glenn Albright in his capacity as a notary public certify documents as witnessed on dates when the signatories were not present. She said this had occurred on at least 2 occasions that she could document with specificity. She said she was not making a general allegation. She was making a specific one, and she was willing to make it with her name attached to it. She said she was saying this now because she believed the notary stamp on the 1989 document being referenced in this meeting deserved independent scrutiny, and because she had decided some time ago that if the moment ever came when saying it mattered, she would say it. She sat down. Thomas was looking at her. He was looking at her the way you look at someone after they have done something that required more than you knew they had, and you are recalculating everything you thought you understood about them. Glenn Albright was standing against the side wall with his arms at his sides and his face doing the work that faces do when a person is trying to maintain an expression while the interior dismantles itself. Ruth did not look at Linda. She did not look at Thomas or at Albright. She was looking at Vane, and her expression had not changed. Vane said very carefully that what was being described were serious allegations requiring formal investigation, and that this meeting was not the appropriate forum. Ruth said, "I am not making allegations. I am presenting records." She picked up the last sheet from the stack on the chair beside her. "This is a statement from Dr. Howard Keeler," she said, "the attending physician at the time of my husband's surgery. It confirms the dates of admission, sedation, and discharge. It confirms that Gene Mercer was not in a condition to execute legal documents during the period from October 7th through October 19th, 1989. Dr. Keeler is 83 years old and lives in Grand Island. He signed this statement 6 weeks ago. She had gone to Grand Island 6 weeks ago. She had driven the 2 hours alone in the truck that Gene had maintained until the year before he died, and that she had maintained since. She had sat in Howard Keeler's living room, a man she had not seen in 25 years, and she had brought him a piece of pie from the bakery on the main road because she remembered that he liked apple, and she had sat with him for 2 hours while he read the documents she had brought. and signed the statement in the careful, slightly trembling script of a man who is 83 and has maintained his precision through the years, the way a good instrument maintains its calibration. She had driven home in the afternoon light through the flat Nebraska country. 2 hours of road and sky and the particular quiet of a drive you have to make alone. And she had placed his statement in the third envelope and put the third envelope in the iron box and put the iron box in the kitchen cabinet above the refrigerator and made herself a cup of tea and sat at Jean's table and thought about the fact that she was ready. Now she set the statement on top of the other papers and folded her hands on the closed iron box in her lap. Let me pause here and ask you something, because this is the moment in the story where the weight of it becomes fully visible. Consider the arithmetic of what was in that room. Agricor had spent $2.3 million preparing for an acquisition that depended on $5,100 worth of land. If the 1967 water rights declaration was valid, and the 1978 conservation easement was valid, and the 1989 agreement was void, then Agricor had no legal claim to the water source that made their $40 million facility viable. The $2.3 million spent on preparation was not recoverable. The $40 million project could not proceed at the planned scale. The 340 jobs that Commissioner Fitch had been publicly supporting did not materialize. All of this rested on one signature on one document from one day in October 1989. A day when the man whose name was on the signature was sedated in an ICU bed, being kept alive by machines, his heart being given its second chance at the only life he had, and the notary who had stamped that document certifying that he had witnessed the signature being placed by a competent adult of sound mind and free will, was standing against the side wall of the Harlan County Community Hall, 55 years old, with his arms at his sides and his large, capable hands very still. Vane looked at the statement in Ruth's hands, and then looked at his portfolio, and then looked at his associate, the younger one on his left, and something passed between them that was not a word. His associate opened a laptop. He began typing. He was researching the affidavit statute Ruth had cited, pulling the actual language of the Nebraska filing from the state's records database, and the look on his face as he read it. A slight pulling together of his brows. The micro-expression of someone finding what they hope not to find told Vane what he needed to know, before his associate looked up to confirm it. The affidavit was real. The statute was real. The protection it conferred was under Nebraska case law, established in 1994, in a guardianship dispute in Douglas County, fully applicable to the instrument in question. The 1989 agreement was not valid. The chain of title was broken. The conservation easement from 1978 was still in effect. The water rights declaration from 1967 was still primary. Agricor did not own what it had been preparing to build on. Thomas Mercer had turned in his chair so that he was facing the back row. He was looking at his mother with an expression that was too complicated for a single name. There was the recognition of something he had misunderstood for a long time. There was the particular kind of grief that comes when you see clearly too late to have acted differently, the fullness of what someone was doing while you were not paying close enough attention. There was something that might eventually become pride, when the rest of it had settled enough for pride to surface. He had told her the night before that she was going to embarrass herself. He had said it gently because he loved her. He had said it because he was a reasonable man with access to reasonable information and a reasonable assessment of the probable outcome. He had not known about the 1967 filing. He had not known about the 1978 easement. He had not known about the affidavit. He had not known that his mother had driven to Grand Island 6 weeks ago to sit with an 83-year-old doctor over apple pie. He had not known that she had spent the night before, unable to sleep. not because she was afraid, but because she was going over the record the way Jean had always gone over a field, before planting methodically, attentively, making sure nothing had been missed. He had known his father was a careful man. He had not understood until this moment exactly how careful, or for exactly how long the care had been operating, or in exactly what direction it had been pointed. Glenn Albright was moving toward the door. He was not running. He was doing the slow, deliberate movement of a large man trying to leave a room without the leaving appearing to be what it was. He had his jacket. He had his phone in his hand. He was looking at the door with the focused attention of a man whose entire processing capacity has been directed at a single exit point. Sheriff Dale Cobb had been leaning against the back wall of the community hall since the meeting began. He was 77 years old, white-haired, large through the chest, with the settled solidity of a man who has spent decades in a physical job and has not entirely left it behind in retirement. He had been the Harlan County Sheriff for 26 years before stepping down the previous January. He had been invited to today's meeting as a courtesy observer, because the county still extended that courtesy to former sheriffs on matters involving significant land transactions, a tradition that went back 40 years and that no one had seen a reason to end. He had been watching the room with the same settled attention he had brought to rooms for most of his adult life. He had watched Vane's presentation. He had watched Ruth Mercer open the iron box. He had watched the room turn and turn again and arrive at this moment. He had known Jean Mercer since 1967, when Cobb was 25 years old and working as a deputy clerk in the county records office the year a young farmer had come in and asked very specific questions about water rights protection, before filing one of the most carefully constructed primary rights declarations that Cobb, who went on to study law at night for 4 years before deciding he preferred fieldwork to courtrooms, had seen in that office before or since. He had been 25. Jean had been 22. They had talked for 2 hours that day in the county records office, 2 young men in a building that smelled of old paper and the beginning of things. And Cobb had thought afterward that if everyone who filed a document understood it, the way that farmer understood what he was filing, the records office would be a different kind of place. He had kept track of Jean Mercer across the years, the way you keep track of people in a small county without meaning to, through the slow accumulation of encounters at feed stores and county fairs, and the occasional appearance of a name on a document that crossed his desk during his 26 years as sheriff. He had attended Jean's funeral in 2014 and shaken Ruth's hand and said the things that are said and meant the things that are meant. He had also in 1978 been one of the 3 witnesses to Jean's signature on the Nebraska Land Trust conservation easement, because Jean had asked him specifically, and because a conservation easement required witnesses of recognized community standing, and because Jean had said simply that he trusted Cobb's name on a document. He pushed himself off the back wall now and walked toward the front of the room, not quickly. He moved like a man who knows where he is going and has enough time to get there without hurrying. He put one large hand on Glenn Albright's arm as Albright reached the aisle. He said it quietly. He said, "Glenn." That was all. Albright stopped. The room which had been watching Ruth turned to watch this. Cobb looked at Albright for a long moment. They had known each other for 23 years since Albright took over the bank. They had interacted across 2 decades of county business loan disputes, property matters, the routine interface of law enforcement and financial institutions in a small Nebraska county. Cobb had always found Albright competent and careful and opaque, in the way that bankers are opaque, skilled at presenting a surface that revealed exactly what they chose to reveal, and nothing else. He had thought about Albright and the 1989 document twice in the past 5 years. He had not been in the room when it was notarized. He had not seen it filed. But he had heard from Clara Hutchins in a conversation that was not a conversation so much as a remark, offered carefully in the direction of someone Clara trusted, that the instrument had a smell to it. Clara did not use that phrase. She never used imprecise language. But the meaning had been clear, and Cobb had filed it away in the place he kept things he could not yet act on. He was a man who trusted the record. He believed in it the way Jean had believed in it, which was the way people who have spent their lives in proximity to official documents come to believe in them. Not naively, not as though records are infallible, but as the best available instrument for making the truth durable. He looked at Albright. Albright was looking at a point slightly to the left of Cobb's face, the look of a man who is reviewing options. "There are not that many options," Cobb said quietly. He said it not as a threat, but as information. The statement Dr. Keeler signed is dated. The affidavit is filed. Mrs. Mercer has the hospital record. Those things do not change based on what you do in the next 5 minutes. He paused. But what you do in the next 5 minutes does change other things, he said. You have been in this county a long time. You might consider what you want that to mean. Albright looked at the door. He looked at the room. He looked at Ruth Mercer, who was watching him with the same level, complete attention she had brought to everything that morning. The attention of a woman who had done her preparation and was now simply present for whatever the record produced. He sat down, not in his original chair, in the nearest chair, which happened to be at the end of a row near the side wall. He sat down heavily, the way a large man sits when the weight he has been carrying becomes suddenly heavier, and he put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. Vane had been watching all of this. He had closed his portfolio. His associate had closed the laptop. The projection screen behind him was still running the drone footage of the valley. That smooth aerial green, the creek running clear, in the June light of a camera's memory. The 15 acres at the bottom of Mercer Valley, sitting in the frame exactly as they had always sat, as they would continue to sit, as the spring in the limestone shelf 90 feet below ran exactly as it had run before any of the people in that room had been born. He looked at Ruth. He was a man who understood information, and the information now was complete and organized and pointed in a single direction, and there was nothing left to perform certainty about. He said quietly that he would need to make some calls. Ruth said nothing. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she looked down at the iron box in her lap. She closed the lid. She latched it. She placed it back in the canvas bag. In the 4th row, Thomas was still turned toward the back of the room, looking at his mother. Linda had put her hand in his. He was holding it. The drone footage played on the wall behind the empty front table. The valley turned slowly in the frame, as it always had, as it would continue to do, long after the SUVs in the parking lot had driven back toward Omaha, and the folding chairs had been stacked against the wall, and the hall had returned to its quiet purpose of serving the ongoing life of a small Nebraska county. Outside, the October wind moved across the fields in the dry, papery way of late autumn, carrying nothing but itself, indifferent and permanent, and entirely unconcerned with the proceedings inside. The community hall of Millard Crossing had hosted a great many things in its years of standing at the intersection of 2 county roads in Harlan County, Nebraska. But it had not often hosted the particular quality of silence that settled over it. In the minutes after Preston Vane closed his portfolio and said he needed to make some calls, it was not an empty silence. It was a silence with weight and temperature and direction. It was the silence that follows the moment when everyone in a room understands simultaneously that the thing which was supposed to happen is not going to happen, and that the thing which was not supposed to happen already has, and that the distance between those two outcomes is wider than anyone on the losing side of it had prepared for. Vane had stepped away from the front table and moved toward the side door of the hall with his phone already at his ear. His two associates were packing the presentation equipment with the focused efficiency of people who have been in rooms when things go wrong and have learned that the correct response is to be useful and quiet. The projection screen was still extended. The laptop was closed. The glossy Agricore folders in their blue and gold sat on the chairs where they had been placed at the start of the morning, most of them untouched. The drone footage had stopped playing. Someone had closed the laptop before the associations between that aerial green and this morning's events could become any more pointed. Commissioner Fitch had not moved from his chair. He was a man who had made public statements about the Agricore project, had allowed his name to appear in the press materials, had described the facility in 2 separate interviews as transformative for the county's economic future. He was sitting with his hands folded on his knees and looking at a point on the wall that did not contain anything with the expression of a man calculating the distance between where he currently stood and where he needed to be by the next news cycle. He would find his way there. Men like Fitch always found their way. But he would spend the drive home rehearsing the pivot, and the pivot would cost him something that rehearsal never fully recovers. Clara Hutchins had not moved from her chair against the far wall. She was 70 years old and had been managing the county records of Harlan County for 22 years, and had in that time seen a considerable number of documents arrive, be filed, be retrieved, be contested, and be resolved. She had a professional's relationship with patience, which is to say, she understood that documents outlast the arguments made about them, and that the correct response to a contested record is not anxiety but thoroughness, and that thoroughness, given sufficient time, produces clarity. She wasn't anxious. She was watching Ruth Mercer sit in the back row with the canvas bag on her lap and the iron box inside it. And she was thinking about a young farmer who had come into the county records office in 1967 and asked the right questions and written down the answers and trusted that the act of recording a true thing would outlast the people who preferred it unrecorded. She had held his copy of the affidavit for 30 years in the county records vault, in a folder labeled with his name and the date behind the 1978 conservation easement filing, which she had also maintained, which she had also cross-referenced correctly when the county assessor's office had restructured its digital records in 2003, and several older instruments had been flagged for archiving rather than active status. She had unflagged them, quietly without announcement, the way a person corrects a small but consequential error when they have the authority and the knowledge to do so. She had never spoken to Ruth about any of it. Jean had not asked her to, and Clara's understanding of her role in the story was that she was the keeper, not the teller. The telling was not her part. The keeping was. She looked at the iron box in Ruth's canvas bag and thought that Jean Mercer had understood something that most people in most rooms like this one do not understand, which is that preparation is a form of love. That doing the work correctly, now the unglamorous and unhurried and carefully documented work, is an act performed not for yourself, but for the people who come after you and will need what you have made without knowing you made it for them. She looked at Ruth. Ruth was not looking at Vane, who was still on the phone near the side door. She was not looking at Albright, who was still seated at the end of the row with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor. She was not looking at Commissioner Fitch or at the Agricore associates or at the untouched folders on the chairs. She was looking at her son. Thomas had turned completely in his chair, now fully facing the back row. and he was looking at his mother with an expression that had moved through several stages in the past 40 minutes and had arrived finally at something that did not have a clean name. It was the expression of a man who thought he understood the situation and had been wrong, who thought he understood his father and had been incomplete, who thought he understood what his mother was capable of and had underestimated her in the specific way that children underestimate parents when they are old enough to be confident and not yet old enough to be wise. He had told her the night before that she was going to embarrass herself. He had said it gently because he loved her. He had said it because he was a reasonable man, doing the reasonable math on what appeared to him to be an unreasonable situation. An elderly woman with a canvas bag and a hardware store box against a firm with 3 lawyers and county support, and a budget for legal proceedings that dwarfed anything she could assemble. The math had been wrong, not because his arithmetic was bad, because he had not known all the variables. He had not known about 1967. He had not known about 1978. He had not known about the affidavit, or about Dr. Keeler in Grand Island, or about the apple pie, or about the 2-hour drive his mother had made 6 weeks ago to sit with an 83-year-old man and ask him to put his name on the truth. He had not known that Jean had been planning for this morning since the morning Jean was 22 years old and had walked into a county records office and understood with the particular clarity of a man who has just seen a neighbor lose what a neighbor should not have lost, that the only protection that actually holds is the one made before it is needed. Dale Cobb came back from the door through which he had followed Albright into the small anteroom that served as a coat room and overflow storage for folding chairs. He walked back into the main hall with the same unhurried steadiness with which he did everything, moving through the space like a man who has inhabited enough rooms in enough circumstances to be comfortable in any of them. He was carrying 2 things. One was the quiet authority of a man who has spent 26 years being the person a room defers to when it needs to know what happens next. The other was a folded piece of paper, the same one Ruth had held up earlier. The hospital record from October 1989, which had been placed on the chair beside her, and which Cobb had asked quietly if he could borrow for a moment. He returned it to her now. He held it out and she took it and placed it back in the envelope and placed the envelope back in the iron box with the same methodical care she had brought to every other action that morning. Cobb looked at the room. He said in the clear, unhurried voice he had used for 26 years in rooms that needed clarity that the county attorney's office would be contacted this afternoon regarding the matters raised about the 1989 notarization. He said this was a procedural statement, not a legal finding, and that the formal determination of what those matters meant would be made through the appropriate channels by the appropriate people. He said he was offering this information because people in the room deserved to know that the morning had produced something that warranted official attention, and that official attention would be given. He said one more thing. He said it without particular emphasis in the same tone he had used for the rest, which made it land harder than if he had underlined it. He said that in his experience, which was considerable, the records that hold are the ones made by people who understood what they were making. He had known Jean Mercer for 52 years, and in his estimation, Jean Mercer had understood very precisely what he was making, and the record reflected it. And the record would continue to reflect it. That was all he said. He went back to his position against the wall. Vane came back from the side door. He had been on the phone for 11 minutes. He was a man who processed information quickly, and who, in his professional life, had learned to distinguish between situations that could be reversed and situations that could only be managed. He had made that determination during the phone call, and the determination had required a different vocabulary than the one he had arrived with. He did not return to the front table. He walked toward the back row. He walked toward Ruth. She watched him come. She watched him the way she had watched everything that morning, with the same steady, complete attention that asked nothing and required nothing and simply saw what was there. He stopped in front of her. He was 43 years old, lean and precise, and his shoes were still clean. But he looked like a man who had recently been in a room he had not adequately prepared for, and was carrying the evidence of that in the set of his shoulders and the careful management of his expression. He said that Agricor would be suspending the acquisition process for the Mercer Valley parcel, pending a full review of the title history. He said the review would be conducted by an independent firm, as the existing review had clearly been insufficient. He said he wanted to express personally his recognition that the morning had not proceeded as anticipated, and that the documentation presented had raised questions that required serious and thorough attention. He did not say he was sorry. He said recognition. He said questions that required attention. These were the words of a man trained in the precise management of language in situations where the wrong word creates liability, and Ruth understood them for what they were, which was the closest a man in his position could come to acknowledging that the thing he had tried to do had not worked, and that the reason it had not worked was that someone had been more prepared than he had expected. Ruth looked at him. She looked at him for a moment that was long enough to be felt, but not long enough to be uncomfortable. Then she nodded. One small, definite movement. Vane turned and walked back to the front table, collected his portfolio, nodded to his associates, and left the hall through the main door. His associates followed. The portable projection screen was still extended. They had not taken it down. It stood against the wall behind the empty front table like a sail that no longer had wind behind it. The room began its own dissolution. People stood. Chairs scraped. The sound of a Nebraska morning in October came through the walls. The dry wind, the distant sound of a truck on the county road. People moved toward the doors in the particular manner of people who have witnessed something they are going to be thinking about for a while, and are already beginning to sort it into the language they will use when they tell someone else about it later. Several people stopped near Ruth as they passed. Some of them touched her arm. Some of them said her name. Some of them said nothing and simply looked at her in the way you look at someone when you want them to know you understand what you saw, without making it larger than it needs to be. Ruth received each of these offerings with the same quiet courtesy, a word, a nod, an acknowledgement that was warm without being expansive. A woman named Dorothy Crane, who had been 2 years behind Ruth in high school, and had brought 3 casseroles over the years, including the one after Jean's funeral. That was a green bean dish with almonds that Ruth had eaten every day for a week, because it was exactly the kind of food that is correct for that kind of grief. Stopped and held Ruth's hand in both of hers for a moment without speaking. Then she left. Thomas was still in the 4th row. He had not moved toward the door. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees in the same posture Albright had held earlier. But the meaning of the posture was entirely different. He was not a man managing the consequences of something he had done. He was a man sitting with something he was only beginning to understand. Linda put her hand on his shoulder. She had gathered their coats from the backs of the chairs. She was ready to leave whenever he was ready, which is to say she understood that he was not yet ready, and she was prepared to wait. Ruth came down the aisle. She walked the way she always walked without hurrying, her canvas bag on her arm. She stopped when she reached Thomas. She looked at him for a moment, her son, 46 years old, with his father's shoulders and his father's gray at the temples, sitting in a folding chair in a community hall that smelled of old coffee and the particular damp of a room that is only heated when it is in use. She put her hand on his head. Just for a moment. The gesture of a mother whose child is grown and for whom the gestures of motherhood have become rare and therefore more precisely chosen. He looked up at her. She said, "Come out to the farm this afternoon. I want to show you something." That was all. She continued down the aisle and out the main door into the October morning. Thomas sat for a moment longer. Then he stood and put on his coat and took Linda's hand and walked out of the hall into the light. Let me tell you what happened in the hours between the meeting and the afternoon, because the story of that day did not end when the SUVs pulled out of the parking lot and drove back toward Omaha. Cobb drove to the county courthouse and met with the county attorney, a woman named Sheila Pratt, who had been practicing property and civil law in Harlan County for 17 years, and who, when presented with the documentation Ruth had produced, and Cobb's account of the morning said very little for a long moment, and then said that she would begin a formal review of the 1989 instrument by end of day. Pratt had seen title disputes before. She had seen fraudulent notarizations before, though they were rare. And when she saw them, they were usually small in scale and motivated by immediate financial pressure, rather than the long-term preservation of a development opportunity. What she was looking at now was a notarization from 1989 that had been made on a document dated during a period when the signatory was medically incapacitated and documented as such in hospital records, physicians' statements, and a state-filed affidavit that had been in the county records vault for 30 years. She said to Cobb carefully that in her professional assessment, the question was not whether the 1989 instrument would be voided. The question was what else that voiding would touch. Cobb said he understood. He drove home. Clara Hutchins spent the afternoon in the county records vault pulling files. She had been expecting to do this at some point. She had known in the way that people who pay close attention to the things in their care sometimes know that the Mercer Valley parcel was going to produce a reckoning eventually, because Gene had been too careful for there not to be a reckoning. And the people who had tried to work around his carefulness had not understood how deep it went. She pulled the 1967 Water Rights Declaration. She pulled the 1978 Conservation Easement. She pulled the affidavit. She pulled the correspondence between the county records office and the Nebraska Land Trust that had accompanied the 1978 filing, which included a letter from Gene written in his precise, even hand, explaining the purpose of the easement and the importance of its permanence. The letter was 5 paragraphs long. It was clear and specific and entirely without drama. The letter of a man who understood what he was asking for and why, and who wanted the record to reflect not just the fact, but the intention. Clara had read this letter before. She read it again. She put the files back in their order and turned off the light and locked the vault. At the farm, Ruth had made lunch before Thomas and Linda arrived. It was soup, the kind that involves whatever is available and several hours of knowing what to do with it. The kind of soup that is indistinguishable from the particular smell of a farmhouse that has been maintaining its own warmth for a long time. She had also made bread, not because the morning had been difficult and bread was comfort, though it was both, but because she made bread on Tuesdays and it was Tuesday. They ate at Gene's table. Thomas ate 2 bowls of soup. Linda ate 1.5. Nobody talked about the morning at first. They talked about other things, about Thomas's current project, a drainage redesign for a municipal system in Lincoln, about Linda's sister who had just had a baby in Omaha, about the particular quality of the October light on the fields outside the kitchen window, which was the horizontal gold-tinted light of a season ending. After lunch, Ruth put on her coat. She picked up the canvas bag which still held the iron box. She said, "Come on." She led them out the back of the house across the yard toward the equipment barn. The barn was the original structure Gene had built in 1981, from timber milled on their own land the summer before Thomas started school. Thomas had spent hours in this barn as a child, sitting on an overturned bucket, watching his father work, handing tools, being told the names of things and what they did and why they mattered. He had not spent much time in it in the past 20 years. Ruth slid the barn door open with one hand, the way Gene had always done it. The door balanced so precisely on its track that a single hand was enough. The light came in with her long and lateral and golden, striping the floor in alternating bands of brightness and shadow. The smell was the same: oil and wood, and the cold, dry smell of stored metal, and the particular dusty warmth of a structure that holds heat differently than a house does. Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed it in and had the experience that certain smells produce, which is not quite memory and not quite presence, but somewhere between them, the sensation of two different times existing simultaneously in the same body. Ruth walked to the workbench along the far wall. It was the same bench. It had always been scarred and worn smooth by decades of work, the surface dark with oil in the places where tools had rested, and lighter where they had not. Gene's tools were arranged along the wall above it, with the same organizational logic he had applied to everything, grouped by function, hung on nails or laid on brackets. Each thing in its place. She set the canvas bag on the bench and opened the iron box. She took out the 3 envelopes and set them aside. Then she reached into the back of the box and removed something she had not shown to anyone in the community hall. It was a green spiral notebook, small, the kind sold at farm supply stores for $1.50. The cover was faded, and the spiral binding was bent from years of being opened and closed, and the edges of the pages had the soft, darkened look of paper that has been touched many times by working hands. Thomas looked at it. Ruth held it out to him. She said, "Your father kept this from 1971 until the year before he died." She paused. He wrote down everything he learned about this land. Everything about the water, the soil, the aquifer, the clay layers, the pressure differentials. All of it. Thomas took the notebook. He opened it. He saw his father's handwriting, which he recognized immediately, and which produced in him the particular sensation that the handwriting of the dead produces the understanding that the person who made these marks is gone, and yet here simultaneously in the evidence of their thinking. The notebook was dense. Gene had written in the small, economical hand of a man who valued space and did not waste it. The entries were dated. They were technical in the way that a farmer's records are technical, which is to say, precisely without ornamentation, with the specificity of someone who understood that vague records are worthless and that the purpose of writing something down is to make it available to someone who was not there when the observation was made. Thomas turned to the entry from 1973. He read the notation about the clay lens. He read the note about the east section, about the depth at which the aquifer ran consistent versus inconsistent, about the specific pressure behavior during peak draw in late July. Anyone drilling in the east section above 380 feet will regret it by August. He looked up from the notebook. Ruth was watching him. She had the expression of someone who has given a person something they needed and is now waiting for them to understand what they have received. Thomas said Agricor's well is at 340 feet. Ruth said nothing. She simply looked at him. He said they drilled 40 feet too shallow. Their whole yield model is off because the aquifer at that depth runs inconsistent through the clay lens during peak season. He said it slowly, the way an engineer says something when he is hearing the problem and the solution at the same time. And understanding that the two have been sitting there, documented, waiting for 46 years in a green spiral notebook in a hardware store box, in a Nebraska farmhouse. He looked back at the notebook. He turned pages. He read more entries. He was reading the way a person reads when they encounter a document that changes the shape of what they thought they understood. Going back, rereading checking dates, following the thread of a careful mind across decades. Linda stood beside him and read over his shoulder. She had the particular quality of a person who can be present without requiring anything from the moment. And she was present, fully reading the notebook with Thomas. And she did not speak because there was nothing to say that the notebook had not already said. Ruth sat down on the old wooden stool she had always used when she came to the barn to talk to Gene while he worked. She sat with her hands in her lap and the iron box beside her on the bench and waited for her son to finish reading. He read for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were different. Not wet, not quiet, but changed in the way that eyes change when something has moved through them that leaves a mark. He said Dad knew. He knew about the clay lens. He knew about the aquifer behavior. He knew every limitation of that land and every strength of it. He documented all of it for 40 years. Ruth said yes. Thomas said, and Agricor spent 2 years and $2.3 million trying to acquire land that won't support the facility they designed, because they didn't read the record. He said it not with satisfaction, but with the particular sadness of a civil engineer who spends his professional life trying to ensure that structures are built on accurate assessments of what they are built on, and who recognizes when he sees it. The specific and preventable tragedy of something built on a false understanding of the ground beneath it. Ruth said, your father used to say that the land remembers everything that has happened to it. He said maps record what instruments detect at a particular time. The ground holds what has been true for 1,000 years. She paused. He believed that if you paid close enough attention to the ground, it would tell you what it needed you to know. He just made sure he wrote it down so the next person wouldn't have to start from nothing. Thomas held the notebook in both hands. He looked at it. He looked at the wall above the workbench where his father's tools were arranged in their logical order. Each thing in its place, the organization of a mind that understood that the purpose of a tool is determined by how carefully it is maintained and how precisely it is used. He said, I told you last night that you were going to embarrass yourself. Ruth looked at him. She did not say anything. He said I was wrong. He said it plainly without qualification. The way a man says something when he means it, and does not need the statement to be anything other than true. Ruth said you were being careful. That is not a wrong thing to be. He said, I didn't know what was in the box. She said no. She said, neither did I completely until I opened it. She paused. Your father was not a man who explained himself more than necessary. He just did what needed doing and trusted that the people who needed to understand it eventually would. Thomas set the notebook down on the bench beside the iron box. He put his hand on the bench on the worn and darkened wood his father's hands had worn and darkened across 28 years of work. He stood like that for a moment. Linda put her hand on his back. She did not say anything. She was a woman who understood when presence was the entire offering required. Ruth watched her son. She saw Gene in him in the set of his shoulders and the way he was standing processing something difficult with the stillness of a person who has learned that the correct response to important things is to be quiet until you understand them. She thought about the night before, sitting alone at the kitchen table with the iron box and the 3 envelopes and the green notebook and the weight of what she was carrying. She thought about Thomas coming downstairs and sitting across from her and telling her gently with love that she was going to lose. She thought about lying in the dark for 3 hours afterward looking at the ceiling. She had not been angry at him. She had understood him completely. He was a reasonable man with access to incomplete information, and he had reached a reasonable conclusion with what he had. She had not blamed him for not knowing what was in the box. She had blamed herself briefly for not having opened it sooner, for having let it sit in the cabinet above the refrigerator for 5 years while Jean was gone. And the world arranged itself in the direction it was going to arrange itself. But then she had remembered what Jean had said. Not a specific sentence, but a quality of thought he returned to regularly across their life together. A belief that the correct moment for a thing is the correct moment and not any other moment. And that the job is not to hurry the correct moment, but to be ready for it when it arrives. She had been ready. The box had been ready. The record had been ready. She stood up from the stool. She picked up the iron box. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight. The same weight she had felt the night before at the kitchen table. The same weight she had felt every time she had moved it from place to place across the years since Jean died. She held it out to Thomas. He looked at it. He looked at her. She said, "I think you should take it." She paused. "Not the documents. Those go back to the county vault with Clara. But the box and the notebook." He did not take it immediately. He looked at it sitting in his mother's hands, gray painted metal, with a hinged lid and a brass latch, the kind of box sold at farm supply stores for $1.50 in 1965. The weight of it was not the weight of the metal. He took it. He held it in both hands. He looked at it. He looked at the notebook beside it on the bench. Ruth said he kept it for a reason. She said, not so it would just be kept. So it would be used. Thomas looked at the notebook. He was a civil engineer. He had spent 23 years in the business of understanding ground, of assessing what structures could be built on it, and how and why, of recognizing the difference between the ground that a survey describes at a particular moment and the ground that has been forming for 1,000 years and carries the record of all of it in its layers. He had left this farm at 18 because he had believed that understanding ground meant going somewhere else to learn the formal systems for assessing it. He had not been wrong, but he had also, in going somewhere else to learn those formal systems, left behind 40 years of a man's patient documented, accumulated understanding of one specific piece of ground. And that understanding, it turned out, contained things that no survey instrument had captured, because no survey instrument had been applied to this ground as many times across as many seasons, with as much attention as Gene Mercer had applied to it across the decades of his life here. He said to his mother, if I wanted to farm the Valley Acres, the 15 acres, not commercially, the easement is in place, but for ourselves, for the farm. Ruth waited. He said, could I use this? He held up the notebook. Would this tell me what I need to know? Ruth looked at the notebook in his hands. She looked at the green cover, faded and worn, the spiral binding bent from use, the edges of the pages soft and dark. She said it would tell you what your father learned. She paused. The rest you would have to learn yourself. That is how it works. He nodded. He held the notebook carefully. She turned and walked toward the barn door. She stopped before she went out into the light. She turned back. She said, come for dinner on Sunday. Both of you. She looked at Linda. She said, I am going to make the green bean dish. Linda said she would be there. Ruth went out into the October afternoon. 2 years passed. Let me tell you what 2 years produced in Harlan County, Nebraska. Because the story of what a careful man plants is not fully told until you describe what grows. The county attorney's review of the 1989 instrument concluded 4 months after the October meeting. The document was voided. The grounds were what Ruth had presented. The signatory was medically incapacitated on the date of execution, as established by hospital records physician's statement and the state-filed affidavit. The notary certification was found to be fraudulent. Glenn Albright resigned from Harlan County Savings and Loan in December of 2019, 2 months after the meeting. He cited personal reasons. The state bar, which had been contacted by the county attorney's office, opened a review of his notary commission. The review concluded in 2020. His commission was revoked. A civil case was filed in his name related to the fraudulent certification. It was settled out of court in 2021 in terms that were not made public, but that Harlan County understood in the way small counties understand things to have been significant. AgriCorps issued a press release in January of 2020 announcing that the Harlan County Facility Project was being redesigned to account for a revised assessment of the regional water infrastructure. The press release did not mention the Mercer parcel or the October meeting or the iron box or the conservation easement that had been in the county records vault since 1978. The 340 jobs, which had been described in 2 interviews as transformative, were not mentioned in the press release at all. AgriCorps' center pivot system on the east section parcels continued to underperform through the 2020 growing season. The yield gap between their projected numbers and their actual numbers widened. An agricultural consulting firm brought in to assess the discrepancy identified the clay lens at 340 feet and the aquifer pressure differential during peak draw periods. Their report noted that the condition was documented in county agricultural extension records dating to 1954. The consulting firm's recommendation was to drill to 400 feet in the sections adjacent to the clay lens, which would increase well costs by approximately $180,000 per installation, and would require a revised economic model for any facility built on those parcels. The revised model did not support the original facility design. AgriCorps began quietly divesting its Harlan County acreage in early 2021. The process was gradual and managed and was not announced. The parcels went back into the county market at prices that reflected 2 seasons of underperformance and the particular discount applied to land that has been assessed by a company that has since reassessed it. Several of those parcels were purchased by the families that had sold them to AgriCorps between 2015 and 2019. They were purchased at prices considerably below the prices at which they had been sold. This is the arithmetic of a certain kind of failure, and it contains its own particular form of justice, which is not dramatic and is not announced, and is simply the ground returning to the people who know it. Thomas Mercer drove up from Lincoln on the first Saturday of April in 2020 with a truck bed full of seed and 2 books he had ordered from the University Extension Library and the green spiral notebook in a canvas bag on the seat beside him. He had read the notebook 4 times across the winter. He had read the Extension Service records for Harlan County from 1954 to 1989. He had called a soil scientist at the University of Nebraska who specialized in aquifer behavior in western Nebraska and had a 2-hour conversation about clay lenses and pressure differentials and the specific behavior of the aquifer in the Mercer Valley section during peak draw. The soil scientist had said at the end of that conversation that whoever had documented the aquifer behavior in that section across the 1970s and 1980s had done work that was as accurate as anything in the university's formal records for the region. He had asked who had done it. Thomas had said, "My father, a farmer." He kept a notebook. The soil scientist had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said that in his experience, the most accurate records of what the ground actually does are almost always kept by the people who are on that ground every day, and that those records almost never end up in the university library. and that this is one of the genuine and persistent losses in the way knowledge about land is accumulated and preserved. Thomas had thanked him. He had driven north. He planted the Valley Acres that April, using the rotation his father had documented as optimal for that specific soil type and water delivery capacity. He planted with the aquifer behavior in mind, timing the water draw to avoid the peak pressure differential period Gene had identified in 1971, and documented every subsequent year. He planted with the notebook open on the tailgate of the truck, while he worked checking his father's observations against what he was seeing, learning to read the ground the way you learn anything that matters, which is slowly and attentively, and with the understanding that the ground will tell you things, but only if you are paying the right kind of attention. Ruth came down to the valley acreage on the second day and stood at the edge of the field and watched her son work. She stood with her hands in her coat pockets and the October light on her face, except it was April. Now the April light, which is different from October and is a beginning rather than an ending. Thomas stopped the tractor and climbed down and stood beside her. She said your grandfather broke this ground in 1931. She said it looking at the field, not at him. He said he knew. She said your father planted it for the first time in 1967. He planted it every year for 28 years. She paused. He knew every inch of it. Thomas said, I know. She looked at him. She said, now you are going to know it too. He looked at the field. He looked at the valley, at the limestone shelf where the spring surfaced at the creek, running clear in the April morning, at the particular green of the valley floor that the drone had captured in June and played on the wall of the community hall. And that was as it turned out. No different in the footage than it was in person, no more and no less beautiful. Simply itself the accumulated result of a spring that had been running for longer than any record had been kept of it. He said Dad knew this was going to happen. Not exactly this, but something like this. Ruth said he knew the land was worth something that people would eventually try to take. He knew that the only protection that lasts is the kind made before it is needed. She paused. She said he used to say some things I plant for the next man or the next woman. He said it about the easement, about the water rights, about the affidavit. He was planning for someone who would need it after he was gone. She looked at her son. She said he was planting for you. Thomas stood beside his mother in the April morning in the valley that 3 generations of his family had worked with, the green spiral notebook in his coat pocket, and the spring running clear below them, and the field opened and ready. And he felt the particular and complex emotion of a person who understands too late to thank the person who made it possible, what was done for them and why. He did not feel triumphant. There was nothing triumphant in it. He felt something quieter and more durable than triumph. He felt the weight of a care that had been practiced across decades, a patience that was not passivity, but was instead the hardest kind of work. The work of doing the correct thing now and trusting the future to need it. That autumn, the Mercer Valley Acres produced 162 bushels of corn per acre, farmed on land with a conservation easement that could never be commercially developed, watered by a spring producing 1.4 million gallons a year, managed according to the observations of a man who had paid attention to that ground for 28 years and written down everything he learned. It was the highest yield of any comparable acreage in the section that year. 3 miles away, the AgriCorps center pivot system was already being disassembled for removal. The last visible evidence of a $40 million project that had been designed without reading the record and had been undone by someone who had. The community hall of Millard Crossing went back to its regular purposes. Pancake breakfasts, county fair planning meetings. The portable projection screen that AgriCorps had left behind was folded and stored in the anteroom with the extra folding chairs. and no one was quite sure whose property it was, so no one moved it. And eventually, people stopped thinking about it. Clara Hutchins filed the Mercer documents back in their place in the county records vault. In the order Jean had kept them, oldest to newest, each one cross-referenced to the others. Each one accessible to anyone who came looking for what was true about that parcel of ground. She added the county attorney's voiding order for the 1989 instrument to the file behind the affidavit in front of the conservation easement. She locked the vault and turned off the light and went home. The iron box sat on Thomas's workbench in the garage of his house in Lincoln, where he had put it after that first Saturday in April. The green notebook was beside it. He had added his own observations from the 2020 growing season in the back pages in handwriting that was different from his father's, but shared certain qualities with it. The economy of a person who understands that the purpose of writing something down is to make it available to someone who was not there. He had left several blank pages between his first entry and Jean's last one, room for what he had not yet learned. The spring in the Mercer Valley limestone shelf ran on through the October of 2021 as it had run through every October before it, as it would run through the Octobers that came after. Indifferent to the legal proceedings that had been conducted above it, indifferent to the photographs taken of it from drones in June, indifferent to the numbers assigned to the land it fed, and the arguments made about those numbers by people in suits, in a room that smelled of old coffee. It ran because it had always run, because the aquifer that fed it was deep and real, and had not changed because of anyone's opinion of it, because Jean Mercer had paid attention to it for 28 years, and had written down what he learned, and had trusted someone to find it when finding it mattered. The most powerful things a quiet man does are never the things he says. They are the things he files, the things he records, the things he places in a gray metal box with a brass latch and trusts the world to find long after he is gone, in the hands of someone who loves him enough to drive 2 hours to Grand Island with a piece of apple pie and ask an 83-year-old doctor to put his name on the truth. Jean Mercer never planted for himself. He planted for the drought he knew was coming. He planted for the people who would need the water long after he was done needing it himself. He planted for the son who would eventually stand in the valley in April, with a green spiral notebook in his coat pocket, and understand finally what kind of man his father had been and what kind of ground he had left behind. He just never told anyone what he had planted. He trusted the record to speak when the record was needed. And when the record was needed, it spoke in the clear, unhurried voice of something that has been true for a long time and is not going anywhere.